Hello, I'm Mary Ito, and welcome to the Cram Podcast. Would you like to think like a Roman emperor? The Roman emperor I'm talking about is Marcus Aurelius, who was born in the 2nd century and ruled for almost 20 years. He was the last of what's known as the 5 good emperors, a golden period of the Roman Empire known for its relative peace and prosperity. But Marcus Aurelius is also known for embracing Stoicism as a way of life. This philosophy has had a resurgence in popularity around the world. According to Donald Robertson, Aurelius was a man of his times and seems to be a man for our times now as well. Robertson is a founding member of the organization Modern Stoicism. He's a former psychotherapist and author of 9 books, including How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. And he joins us. Welcome to Cram, Donald.
Well, thanks, Mary. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Oh, me too, because I just finished your book. I've got a million questions because it was so rich in content. I'm going to start off and go way back with what you talked about in your introduction. And you spoke about your father's death when you were a young man. I think you were about 13 when he died. And you said that that moment, that experience put you on a path towards Stoicism. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, well, I hadn't even thought about this until after I wrote the book, I think. But Marcus Aurelius, of course, lost his father when he was even younger. And so there are some parallels. I was looking for a substitute, I think, for a father figure when I was a teenager. I felt quite lost. And I was looking for some kind of direction or purpose in life. And somehow I found it in philosophy. I started reading classics, and I didn't have any dad. I didn't have a father to look to ask questions about, what I should be doing in life, what should my priorities be, how to deal with the kind of problems and decisions that I was facing. And so I think perhaps Marcus Aurelius was going through something a little bit like that in his own way. And Stoicism or philosophy in general, I think for many people can fill that gap and provide a kind of roadmap, a sense of direction in life when they don't have an individual, a person around to act as a mentor and guide.
It's interesting because I've read that young people in particular have been drawn to Stoicism, and you were a young person. Can you talk about what was it about this particular school of thought that attracted you?
Well, originally I studied philosophy at university, and I looked at lots of different types of philosophy. And Stoicism is one of the few major schools of ancient philosophy that isn't normally covered in the undergraduate philosophy curriculum. So I didn't really find out about it until after I graduated. I was particularly interested when I was a student in existentialism. And I looked at lots of different philosophies, but they all seemed kind of abstract in a way and not very down to earth and practical. And ancient philosophy, because of its relative simplicity, at least in some regards, was more workable, it seemed to me. It was closer to something like yoga or Buddhism in that regard. I could actually imagine living in accord with Stoicism, and people did live in accord with it. For 500 years in the ancient world, it flourished as a philosophy of life. And I was attracted to it for the same reason that many people are, that initially Stoicism offers a way of coping with adversity and developing emotional resilience. In fact, the word Stoicism today has almost become a byword for resilience. These similar concepts to many people. But beneath that, Stoicism offers something more than just a way of coping with anxiety and stress. It offers an ethical worldview and a sense of purpose and direction. So that's ultimately what I got for it. That's why I stayed around and I continue to be interested in it.
Yeah, you know what? You bring up a good point, because I think when people use the word stoic today and they say, someone is stoic, that can even have negative connotations. People sometimes assume it means, the person, he has no emotions or he's repressing all his emotions, almost like a robot. So can you talk about the difference between that and the philosophy?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. We should address that, because I would call that one of perhaps the most widespread misconception about Stoicism, right? So in the ancient world, there were various schools of philosophy, and today we talk about skepticism, sophistry, Epicureanism, cynicism, academia, stoicism. All of those words derive from schools of ancient Greek philosophy, but their meaning has changed over time, and generally it's become simplified, kind of pared down. When we say that someone's cynical today, we mean they have a kind of negative attitude towards other people. We don't mean they follow the ancient school of Greek philosophy associated with Diogenes the Cynic, for example. And it's the same with Stoicism. And to distinguish these, academics usually write the school of philosophy with a capital letter. So capital S Stoicism versus, if you like, lowercase Stoicism, which means today being unemotional or having a stiff upper lip. Sometimes people say. I would describe it in slightly more technical terms, if you like, as a character trait or an emotional coping style that seeks to suppress or conceal unpleasant or embarrassing emotions. And I can formulate it in kind of jargony terms because it's lowercase Stoicism is a construct that's of interest to modern psychology and has been fairly extensively studied. And the finding generally has been that it's not very good for your mental health to be a lowercase Stoic. And in fact, in the long term, people that suppress or conceal unpleasant or embarrassing emotions tend to be more prone to problems like anxiety and depression, and they cope quite badly with adversity and with stress. So there's a lot of interest in that area and lots of converging findings from different researchers around the world. And that would be particularly important because, as we'll probably come to later, capitalist Stoicism, the philosophy, inspired modern cognitive behavioural psychotherapy.
Yeah, I absolutely want to. Yeah, I want to get into that.
We'll stick a pin in it.
For sure.
I just want to say that cognitive behavioural therapy is known to be good for your mental health, and lowercase Stoicism is bad for your mental health. So you wouldn't want to confuse those two things. And in fact, the internet, however, is awash with people that do confuse lowercase Stoicism with Stoic philosophy, when in fact one's healthy and the other's unhealthy. So it's a particularly unfortunate thing to get confused about. Right.
Okay, so you are an uppercase Stoic.
Yeah.
So let's talk about what that is.
Capitalized Stoicism.
What is capitalized Stoicism?
Well, where did it come from? The philosophy itself is based very simply on one central principle, which is that virtue, arete in Greek, you could also translate that as moral wisdom, by the way. Virtue or moral wisdom is the only true good. And the main corollary of that is that the things that people generally believe to be good or important in life, such as wealth and reputation, are not really as important as the majority of people believe. And then the main consequence of that would be if you followed a moral philosophy and really embraced it, that taught you that your character traits, having strength of character, wisdom and virtue was the main thing, wealth and reputation and things like that aren't as important as people think, then you would, as a consequence, probably be more resilient in the face of adversity, because if your reputation was damaged or you lost your fortune in a shipwreck, you'd be less upset about it because it would be less important to you. And the way that you cope with that would be of paramount importance.
Can you talk about, aren't there certain, traits or characteristics that are highly valued, like courage?
Yeah. The cardinal virtues, they're called in ancient Greek philosophy. So this goes back to Socrates. The idea traditionally was that there were 4 cardinal virtues, and wisdom is the most important one. And then justice is the second most important one. The Greek word for justice, dikaiosune, actually includes being kind or benevolent towards other people, which is lost in translation a little bit. So it means being fair, but also being compassionate and kind to other people. It's social virtue in general, if you like. So there's wisdom, social virtue, and then 2 other virtues that relate to self-mastery, courage and self-discipline. You need courage if you want to behave consistently with wisdom and justice, despite facing fear. You're going to have to overcome your fears in order to do that. And you're going to have to moderate your desires if you want to do that as well. So you're going to need, here's the list, wisdom, justice, courage, and moderation.
Okay. And did the Stoics believe that all four virtues are attainable?
Yes and no. They thought that in principle they were, but they argued about whether they ever had been, because they were kind of idealistic. They talk about what they call the sophos, or the ideal sage, the person who's attained enlightenment, a bit like the idea of a Buddha, if you like. And they weren't sure whether anyone like that had ever existed or not. They thought Socrates probably came quite close, but they weren't sure. They sometimes said the sage or the sophos is as rare as the Ethiopian phoenix, which according to mythology was born every 500 years. So a bit like Buddhism, they had this idea that maybe there are enlightened people, but they come around in cycles and they're pretty exceptional. So they thought that the important consequence of that is that the Stoics believed that majority, like basically everybody, is unenlightened and flawed. So they really emphasize our imperfection. They thought there's a kind of humility to Stoicism, including the founders of Stoicism.
Yeah, I mean, what strikes me about what you're saying is that to achieve that ultimate goal, right, where you have attained all those four virtues seems highly unlikely, but it's the journey towards it.
Yeah.
That's what is important. And that's also what I'm guessing makes you a better person.
It's an aspirational goal, and it's like describing a utopian society.
Yeah.
Like ideally, it'd be great if we could achieve perfection in this regard, but it's the journey towards it that's the most important thing. Epictetus, another Stoic, says something I think quite nice in that regard. We have a record of how he talked to his students. And he
was the former slave, right? The slave who became a Stoic philosopher. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah. And he says to his students, who are often Roman elites, actually, he's a slave talking to wealthy, powerful, elite Romans. He says, none of you are Socrates, but at the very least, you could wish to become like Socrates. So he's saying you shouldn't be conceited enough to think that you're enlightened. But what matters is that at least you want to be enlightened. At least you have a desire to improve yourself and a sense of the goal that you're aspiring to.
You know what? I want to quote three things that three different Stoic philosophers said, because I really like these phrases, and they all. Well, let me tell you them, and then I'll tell you what I think, and then you can tell me what you think. So the first one is, it's not things that upset you, but our judgment of things. Mm-hmm. The second one is, we suffer more from imagination than reality. Mm-hmm. And the third one, our life is what our thoughts make it.
That's Epictetus, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius.
Right. Yes, you do. Yeah. And what struck me about all those is the disconnect that we have between our internal reality and our external reality.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is central to almost all psychotherapy, right?
Yeah.
We're doing it to ourselves. Like, it's our thinking that causes a lot of our problems. It's the way that we choose to represent reality. And that's where our locus of control lies. We can do something about the way that we think, the attitude that we adopt towards external events. This was a big revelation in ancient philosophy. You can definitely build a whole philosophy and a whole therapy just around that, that first quotation that you mentioned, which is that it's not things that upset us, but rather our opinions or our judgments about them. I think it's perhaps one of the most profound insights in ancient philosophy. And as we'll see, that quote is perhaps the most famous quote from Stoicism. I'll stick my neck out and say that, for the simple reason that it's so extensively quoted in the texts of modern psychotherapy. That was how I first came across it. As I was training as a psychotherapist, I kept reading this quote from Epictetus over and over again, because it resonated so much with modern therapists.
So tell me, how then do you take this philosophy and then it becomes a way of life? You know, it
Mhm.
becomes an approach to life. How do you do that?
I think, first of all, it comes down to, let's put it this way. So if we take this idea that, hey, maybe the things that upset you might not upset other people. Maybe other people would see them as a challenge, but not as catastrophic. Or they might see them as bad, but not as bad as you feel that they are. They might see them as an opportunity. Maybe there's more than one perspective that you could adopt on adversity. Then, based on that insight, you probably want to develop greater self-awareness of how your thoughts are influencing your feelings, and maybe even a kind of mindfulness, if you like. There is a Greek word, prosoche, that more or less means mindfulness. It means constant attention to the way that you're using your mind, your thinking, your value judgments. And so that would be a continual daily practice. Basically, you could work in a number of ways. The first book I wrote on Stoicism, I tried to list all the psychological techniques that I could find, and there were about 18 distinct. The Stoics have a big toolbox of psychological techniques. They don't just have one or two. So you'd have this basic idea and then have a whole bunch of different techniques that you could use to facilitate identifying certain thoughts that were causing you emotional problems and modifying those thoughts and beliefs in a rational, a philosophical direction. But then also you can build a value system around it, as we mentioned earlier. You could say, well, maybe what other people say about me and maybe how much money I have is not the be all and end all of life. Maybe what's more important is how I deal with those things, how I respond to them. Maybe it's what you make of life that really matters. And I should be focusing more on that and make, my ability to cope well with these things a priority. What would we call the ability to cope well? Like resilience, strength of character, wisdom, perhaps. These are the virtues in Stoicism. So it starts off with a bunch of psychological techniques, and it ends up, I think, in a change in your whole orientation and your fundamental values.
So can we talk about this in kind of a very practical way?
Yeah.
Because I can't remember, it was maybe towards the end of the book, you talked about going through these, your own values and what are your own values. And you actually do this every day.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So what does that look like?
Well, I mean, for example, one way of doing this is a very simple framework that you can use, which was similar things we used in the ancient world, whereby each evening, there's a famous text which everyone can go and look up. It's only a couple of pages long, called the Golden Verses of Pythagoras. It was associated with another school of philosophy. The Stoics were really into it. They borrowed it and they would quote from it. And there's a famous passage in the Golden Verses of Pythagoras that says, every night, before sleep closes your eyes, review the events of the day 3 times and then ask yourself 3 questions. You might say, well, what are those 3 questions? And the 3 questions the Pythagoreans and the Stoics would ask themselves are, what did you do well? What did you do badly? And what did you omit to do? So you can refer that to your core values. You could say, what did I do that was in accord with my core values in life? What did I do that exhibited wisdom, and justice and kindness and self-discipline and courage today? And maybe I can give myself some encouragement, some reinforcement to keep doing that, keep moving in that direction. What did I do badly? Did I exhibit any foolishness or injustice or unkindness or recklessness, for example, today? How can I make sure that I don't do that again? How can I get rid of those bad habits? And was there anything that I could do differently tomorrow that I just didn't even think of doing today? Are there any new activities or tasks that I could undertake that would help me exemplify and cultivate those character traits? If you do that each evening, and then the next morning you prepare yourself for the day ahead by thinking, okay, if I was exemplifying those values, how would I deal differently with the meetings that I have today and the tasks that I have to accomplish? And what would it be like if I was guided by fear and anger? What would it be like if I was guided by wisdom and self-discipline? So in the morning, you can think about your day ahead and mentally prepare yourself for it. And then in the evening, review your progress in a kind of learning cycle. each day. I don't know if that was the framework you were referring to, but that's a very broad framework that I tend to recommend that people use if they want to work on living in accord with their values. And then all the other techniques can fit quite neatly within that context, if you like.
Yeah, I was actually thinking it was something about your own values, but it was much broader. It was sort of about, in a big way, what your values are in life. But I love those questions, because what I find so interesting about those questions is that every question is about you yourself and the role that you played in your life on that day. You're the one who takes responsibility. Whereas I know quite often we can get caught in this thing of, if we're looking over the day, we might think, oh, why were they so mean to me? Why did they say those things? Or my boss, like, he ignored me in that meeting. Like, why didn't he? And so we think about what's done to us very often. Yeah. Whereas that takes a more active role of what did we do that was good? What did we miss? What can we do better?
Yeah. How could I cope with that better? What can I learn from it?
Yeah.
Like, if it's a self-improvement process where the focus, the whole orientation is much more on improving your character. The Stoics are the great granddaddies of all self-improvement, in a sense. They were way ahead. We tend to think of self-help as a modern phenomenon, but we're wrong in that regard. Like, self-help absolutely existed as a literary genre, and a concern in the ancient world very explicitly. So, by the way, here's a bit of trivia. Most people think psychotherapy is a modern discipline, and it absolutely is not. Like, psychotherapy explicitly existed in the ancient world. We have entire books that were written on the subject. It's many people think it began with Sigmund Freud, but it really didn't. Like, we absolutely have psychotherapy in ancient Greece and Rome.
You know what, though? Can I ask you, like, it must be very difficult, though, because, sometimes people feel that they are victims.
Yeah.
And so to turn that thinking around, where, you can think, oh, why is my family like this with me? Why are my friends, not considerate? Why is my boss not paying attention? Why is society the way it is? I feel a victim of society. Like, you must hear this. Like, how do you change that thinking around?
Well, you have to, first of all, it's almost like you have to hold a mirror up to yourself, right? I think the problem is that we all have a blind spot. We can see other people's flaws, and often we're better at solving other people's problems than we are at solving our own. There's actually research that confirms that people tend to be better at solving other people's problems than they are at solving their own, because of cognitive biases and blind spots that we have. So first of all, we have to kind of hold up a mirror and learn to be able to take a step back and observe ourselves more carefully. And then we begin to say, what causes our problems? Well, normally when we're really upset, we tend to attribute the blame to things that are outside of our direct control. Maybe it's my awful childhood that caused all my problems. Maybe it's my parents. Maybe it's my boss. Maybe it's Donald Trump or Joe Biden, or, maybe it's just how awful the internet is and society in general. Maybe life just sucks. But when we do that, we're kind of overlooking the role that we play ourselves in constructing our problems. Many of the things that upset us wouldn't upset us if it wasn't for the values that we hold. If somebody's rude to me, it would be meaningless to me unless I placed some value in their opinion. So there's an interaction between the external event and our attitudes, thinking, and values. And we can simply ask ourselves, do other people feel the same way about these events, or do they sometimes cope better? Do other people sometimes exhibit a more philosophical attitude towards adversity? And what's the difference? How do they manage to do that? We call that modeling in psychology. We can look at other people's ability to cope and think, can I learn something from the way that other people are maybe navigating these problems in life? Am I thinking of myself too much as a victim? Do other people face similar problems or even worse problems and view themselves more constructively as a survivor, or maybe even as thriving and growing stronger as a result of adversity?
Is this where in the book you talk about who are the people you admire? Or even if you didn't have someone, what would be the qualities they have? And how can
Yes.
we aspire towards that? How would they act in this situation?
Yeah, this is actually a kind of recurring question in ancient philosophy. So one of the fundamental questions that you might ask, maybe this is the one you were thinking of earlier, is that I think it's important to ask yourself what your goal is in life and what you want your life to stand for.
Yeah.
We talk a lot about self-improvement today, but self-improvement and self-help are kind of meaningless in a way unless you know what it is that you're trying to achieve. I think we can see that a lot of self-improvement content today has kind of gone astray in that it becomes about things like seduction or, getting girls. I'm talking about the manosphere here. Being successful in your career. So it's self-improvement stuff, but it's about kind of, relatively superficial goals. Is this real self-improvement? Self-improvement can go somewhat astray if we lose sight of what it actually means to improve ourselves. What it is that we're trying to become. How do we better ourselves? So the Stoics think, look, you have to start by asking yourself what the goal of self-improvement actually is. As Seneca says, no winds are favourable unless you know to which port you're attempting to sail. No form of self-improvement is going to be of any benefit to you unless you know what it actually means to improve yourself. What's the goal that you want? What are your core values? And another way of putting that would be in ancient philosophy, they use this word that's tricky to translate. It's a bit like nirvana in Buddhism. It's eudaimonia in Greek. And it means flourishing. It's kind of the ultimate goal of life. It's like the peak for humanity. It's what the sophos, or the wise person, has, that's born like the Ethiopian phoenix every 500 years. So human flourishing, the peak that we could possibly hope for as a human being. What does that look like? And the Stoics and other ancient philosophers generally thought it probably has something to do with wisdom or enlightenment, and also being a moral person, being a good person, and also having some strength of character, self-discipline, and endurance as well. So we want to ask ourselves those questions, but one of the main aids to doing that is to ask ourselves what the qualities are we most admire in other people. So, and one of the main aids to asking that question is to, sometimes people say, I don't know what I admire. So a lot of young people today get confused and they feel that they'll complain that they feel nihilistic. They don't, society and the internet bombards them with information, and they're left feeling that they don't know what their values are, very confused about things. But one way of dredging out our values is to say, well, what really annoys you about other people? And I have to say, when you ask that question, almost everybody gives the same answer, funnily enough. And their main targets, and sorry to say this, politicians, but it's people involved in politics. They usually say, what I really can't stand is all these corrupt politicians out there. And I think it's because politicians by their very nature are kind of in the limelight and in the news constantly. So people will tend to complain about the qualities that they really detest in the politicians that they dislike. But if you hate dishonesty and corruption, that suggests that you value authenticity and integrity as positive values, right? So you can kind of flip it around. If you feel that your parents were awful, then, that kind of implies that you have an idea of what would constitute the desirable qualities, the opposite qualities in a parent. So thinking very deeply about what you disvalue in other people and what the opposite would be, or what you positively value in your heroes and role models, if you have any. The next question following that very simply is, if you say, well, I think, the type of friend I would like to have, for example, the sort of person I admire would be somebody who's got a lot of patience, and a lot of integrity. You might say, well, how many of those qualities do you possess yourself? Right? Turning the table around. And, in many cases, people will be able to identify the qualities that they would admire or dislike in others, but they haven't thought about the extent to which they exemplify those qualities themselves. And an even harder, tougher, meaner question that we can ask, that we often ask in therapy, is, say somebody says, what I really value is compassion and creativity. That's what I think, life is all about. So you might say to them, how many minutes did you spend or hours yesterday exhibiting compassion and creativity? And Mary, the most common answer to that question is 0. That's one of the most shocking things I've ever encountered in all my years as a therapist. But time and time again, when I say to people and we dig around and try and identify their core values, the things that they believe fundamentally make life worth living, and I say to them, so like, how many minutes or hours did you spend doing something that accords with those values yesterday or over the last week? Usually they say 0. And, I can't emphasize it enough how common that is and how shocking it is in a way.
And is there a common reason as to why the answer would be 0?
Generally, I think it's because we've all been led a merry song and dance and kind of duped by the baneful influence of things that surround us, other people, social media. We're led by the nose, unfortunately. It's something about human nature that makes us easily influenced by things that we see going on around us. And for whatever reason, I think as small children, we don't know what our values are. We're just beginning to figure out how the world works. And we look around, and you would forgive a small child in ancient Athens or Rome or today for concluding that the most important thing in life is money. And would you not? If they look around, they might think everyone else seems to be obsessed with money and property and social status, So it's no surprise that we acquire these relatively superficial values, I think. Time and time again throughout history, that's what we see as we look around us. But then at some point in life, maybe you go through a kind of crisis and you reflect on your values and think, you know what, I've had a good old hard think about this, and I've come to the conclusion that maybe it's not all about money and status, and maybe there's something more. But I'm lying on my deathbed here now, looking back.
Yeah, it's a little late. It's a little late.
Yeah. And, this is a theme in ancient philosophy that it often is death or coming to terms with our own mortality that kind of is a wake-up call. It snaps us out of the trance of the prevailing values of our society and makes us question things more deeply. Now, if we're lucky, we're not like 100 years old lying on our deathbed thinking, maybe I wasted my entire life pursuing these superficial values, too late now. Sometimes people have a brush with death earlier. They have a health scare or they find themselves in a dangerous situation. But I think more often, it's a little bit more indirect, and it's that people are bereaved. And to come back to what you said earlier, I lost my father when I was 13. Marcus lost his father when he was about 3 or 4 years old. And sometimes it's bereavement that can make us question our purpose and our direction in life and think maybe it's not all about money and maybe it's not all about status and success in those terms. Maybe there's some sort of deeper meaning that we can find in life. And, the ancient philosophy is all about, first and foremost, just encouraging people to dig deeper and ask those fundamental questions.
Well, the examine life.
Yeah.
Right? That's what it is. Yeah.
Is not worth living, said Socrates.
Yeah. So we need to examine our lives. So you know what? I'm glad you brought up Marcus Aurelius again, because your book is centered around him as a role model. And it's interesting because, he's a Roman emperor that is so far removed from, most of us, almost all of us. And yet you use him as a role model, right? For Stoicism. Yeah. So why is that? Like, how is it that we can relate to the life of Marcus Aurelius?
Well, he's quite a relatable guy, surprisingly, isn't he? That might come as a shock. First of all, I'll say there's something odd about the book, the Meditations. There's some mysterious things about it. We believe it was never intended for publication. I don't believe it was intended.
So you're talking about the Meditations, which is, people may not be familiar with that.
It's the book that we have from Marcus Aurelius. It's his notes on applying Stoic philosophy to his own life. And they look like private notes. There's a couple of clues that indicate that it probably wasn't intended for publication. For example, among other things, he'll make remarks that would be very cryptic. He'll talk about a conversation that he had with his father, for example, and then not elaborate on it. So you think, well, he's the only person that would know what that meant. Mm-hmm. So it's more like a journal or a diary than something that he intended for publication, it seems. And the way that it's written, though, in one sense, it looks almost like it was intended to be published in terms of the style of the writing, because it's often artfully vague. The first chapter, he talks a lot about his friends and family, his tutors and his family, and what he admires most in each of them. He does this exercise we just described. He goes through about 15 different people and lists the qualities that he admires most in them. But the rest of the book is a kind of random mixture of different observations and psychological exercises. But one odd thing about it is it's often phrased in such an artfully vague way that people feel that they could step into it. So the most famous quote, most widely quoted passage in the Meditations is the beginning of the second book. And he says, every morning when you wake up, tell yourself that you're going to encounter people that are disloyal, petty, deceitful, stubborn, and so on. And he prepares himself in advance to deal wisely with challenging people. Now, he does not say, every morning when you wake up, tell yourself that you're going to have to talk to that horrible German ambassador again that's always lying to you or something like that, because that would make it less relatable. It would make it very much of its time, be interesting, it would be very useful to a biographer. But he phrases it in such an artfully vague way that you or I might read it, and he probably is talking about some German envoy or a senator or something, or a member of the imperial family. But we read it, and he said, every morning, tell yourself that you're going to deal with people that are deceitful and petty and meddling. And we think, well, that sounds like my mother-in-law. Or it sounds like one of the guys that's that guy that works is at the desk across from me, But we are able to insert ourselves into the Meditations because it's phrased in this abstract way.
And what is the purpose of that? Is the purpose in that you are preparing yourself, and so you're not caught off guard? You will know now how to deal with those people in a rational, calm, wise way.
Well, there's no end to the profound observations that the Stoics make. I don't say that lightly, I'm kind of half joking, but really they say so many very psychologically insightful and profound things. One of them is that they absolutely are correct in observing that when people experience anger and anxiety, they very often express surprise or shock. It's writ large in the language that we use. We say, I can't believe this guy. How could anybody be so stupid? Like, when we're angry or upset about things, we sound really shocked and really surprised. But the Stoics, way ahead of us, say, when you look at someone else doing that, you might think, but the thing that they're surprised about is really common. So someone stole your wallet when you were on holiday. I can't believe it. How could anybody do such a thing? It's no way. How could this possibly have happened? But then tourists get their wallets stolen every day, in these spots. So from the Stoics think that we need to achieve this more objective perspective and overcome the shock and surprise. And part of that, they're absolutely spot on, that shock amplifies the distress that we have. Right? It's almost like rhetoric. If I wanted to make other people more hyped up about something, I'd make it seem really shocking and surprising. But we do that to ourselves by the language that we use, right? Whereas if we described it in a more matter-of-fact way, it would be less upset and it'd be easier for us to figure out how to cope with it and what to do next. The Stoics want us to look on these kind of setbacks or events as if they're the most familiar thing in the world, because they think that's the key to coping with them wisely. I saw there's a guy a professor called Lord Farnsworth. He's a professor of law who wrote a good book called The Practicing Stoic, and he gave a really good explanation of this, in my view. He said, suppose you were being treated by a paramedic, you'd been in a terrible car accident, And so it's kind of a horrific scene, and an ambulance arrives and they're treating you. Would you want somebody who's inexperienced and is just aghast at the blood and the horror? Or would you want to be treated by somebody who's been doing it for a long time and is kind of desensitized to seeing gruesome stuff, right? So they're not desensitized in the sense of being kind of cold-hearted, but just in the sense that they're able to get on and do their job, to do what needs to be done in the situation without being freaked out by it. And so the Stoics think the goal of Stoicism in this regard is to be like an experienced paramedic or physician who's seen it all before and isn't shocked or flustered by setbacks or things that seem catastrophic to other people. And the Stoics say, how can we emulate that? We could do it by practicing in our imagination to prepare ourselves in advance, to imagine going bankrupt, to imagine what would happen if our relationship collapsed. How would we survive? What would you do next? And then what would you do? And then what would you do? And then what would you do? What would you do weeks and months and years down the line to move on from these kind of setbacks? What would you do if you lost your job? Would your head explode? Or, would you start looking for a new job? Would you start your own business? How would you deal with that? It forces us to begin thinking about problem solving. There's a passage in Socrates, in Plato's Republic, where he's describing Socrates, that people often overlook because it's at the end of Plato's Republic, which is quite a long book. So I think a lot of people get halfway through and then they maybe start to fade a little bit. They struggle maybe to get to the end where there's some juicy information. Socrates is having a conversation where he's like the granddaddy of Stoicism. He's prefiguring Stoicism. And he's talking to Plato's older brother, Glaucon, and they're talking about Greek tragedy. And Socrates says, I think in Greek tragedy, the way that people cope with misfortune is foolish. And Glaucon's like, what are you talking about, Socrates? Tragedy is the highest form of Greek art. And he said, I don't think these people provide good role models. They generally just make things worse for themselves by the way that they respond to the setbacks that they encounter. And Glaucon's like, well, what do you mean, Socrates? How do you think a wise person should respond to misfortune or adversity? And Socrates says, if I remember rightly, there are 4 things that he thinks we should do. The first is that he says a wise person suspends judgment about things that happen. So whether it seems like good fortune or bad fortune, they say, I can't really be sure whether getting this promotion is going to be good or bad in the long run. What seems like good fortune can often turn out to be for the worst in the long run, or what seems like a setback, like losing your job or a relationship breaking up, might be the best thing that ever happens to you. And he says the second thing is that they tell themselves that there's no point making their suffering even worse by worrying or grieving unnecessarily about it. So misfortune's already unpleasant, and freaking out about it just makes it twice as unpleasant. He says a wise person realizes they're just increasing their suffering unnecessarily by complaining excessively and worrying excessively about it. He says the third thing is a wise person tells themselves that nothing in life, no individual event is all important. It's just one event within a longer story of your life. Because normally when we get really upset about things, it's like we put them under a microscope or a magnifying glass and we get tunnel vision for them. So somebody says, Donald, you're a jerk. And suddenly that's all that matters. I forget about everything else that's ever happened, between us and in life in general. And suddenly I'm just focusing on that one remark as if it's all important. Because actually it's a drop in the ocean. It's one fleeting event within a much longer story about our relationship and about life in general. Socrates says no individual event is all important. Everything has to be seen within a wider context. And Glaucon says, well, you said there were 4 things, Socrates. So what was the 4th thing? Socrates says, the 4th thing's the most important one. He said grieving excessively, by which he means freaking out and worrying and getting all upset and flustered about things, prevents us from doing the thing that's most required in the face of a crisis. And Glaucon says, well, what's that? And Socrates says, well, it's to think calmly and rationally and find a solution and solve the problem. But if we freak out and complain and get really upset about things, that actually prevents us from doing anything rational to address the problem and move forward. So again, like the experienced paramedic, we want somebody who's unfazed and has seen it all before, because that's the person that's most likely to be able to actually deal with the problem.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There were a couple of things in the book you talked about as well. And one of them was, and it relates to what you're talking about right now. You said that when we face difficult situations, challenges in life, that we approach them with a reserve clause.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you talk about that? I've never heard that phrase, a reserve clause.
It's a technical term in ancient Greek. So the Stoics weren't playing. The Stoicism evolved over 500 years. It was more sophisticated in many ways. I can tell you, it was more theoretically substantial and sophisticated than many modern models of psychotherapy are today. It really was. So they had technical concepts and a technical vocabulary and classificatory systems and things it's a big philosophy, even though there might be simple aspects to it. So hupexaresis is translated as reserve clause. It's hard to translate into English. It's pretty hard to say in Greek. And it means something relatively simple. It means that when you pursue or desire any external course of action or outcome. The example I think that Seneca gives is, I will go to Athens, right? So I want to go to Athens. It's a practical undertaking, but you might not be able to. You don't know, the ship might sink, or you might get sick or something like that, for all you know. It's not entirely under your control. It's always partially in the hands of fate. So the Stoics say that to avoid rigidly demanding things that aren't entirely under our control, we should always attach a caveat that goes something along the lines of, I will go to Athens, fate permitting. I will go to Athens if nothing prevents me. I will go to Athens, God willing. Or some kind of caveat that acknowledges the possibility that we might be thwarted or obstructed in our undertakings. So that allows us to be more flexible and adaptive in our thinking. That is very similar to one of the central principles of modern cognitive psychotherapy. So it's often said today that psychological problems happen when the natural desires that we have become ossified or fossilized into rigid demands. So I might say to you, I love it when people praise my work. It's fantastic. It's one of my favorite things in life. But if sometimes they don't, it's not the end of the world. But if I go a step further and say, I need people to praise my work, people must praise my work. Otherwise, it means I'm a complete failure. Or otherwise, I just find that awful, catastrophic, and unbearable. So there's a line that we cross that goes from a natural, flexible, adaptive desire or preference into a rigid, unconditional demand. And that is the dividing line between normal psychological functioning and neurosis, if you like. It's a recipe for neurosis to rigidly demand things that aren't entirely under your control. And the Stoics knew that. They knew that if you're desiring anything that isn't entirely under your control, like going to Athens, it's normal to desire these things, but you have to attach some kind of caveat that recognizes that you might be thwarted and prepares you in advance to cope with that in a rational and a healthy way, rather than just freaking out.
What about, I also remember the term, and I guess this is another Stoic term, and I don't know if it's used in CBT, but stress inoculation.
Yeah, that's my wife's favorite term.
Is it?
Maybe
okay.
That tells you something. Yeah, she goes on about it a lot.
Oh, okay. Tell us.
My wife loves stress inoculation. That's a term that comes from cognitive behavioural therapy, old school cognitive behavioural therapy in the 1970s. It was developed by a psychologist called Donald Robertson.
Isn't it a Stoic principle too, though? Doesn't it come from Stoicism?
Yeah,
okay.
It's very similar to the idea that we have in Stoicism. The Stoics think that the Stoic term for it is premeditatio malorum in Latin. And they think that we should systematically, on a daily basis, picture the type of misfortunes that could befall us in life as if they're happening now. So we should face our fears, basically. And if we can't do it in reality, we should at least do it in imagination. So as we mentioned earlier, we should imagine going bankrupt, a relationship breaking down. The Stoics think ultimately we should imagine our own death. Which sounds a bit extreme, but Buddhists have similar contemplative practices, and so do many other spiritual traditions in the world.
Okay, but hold it. Like every day? Like, do I need to do this every day? I mean, isn't that a bit much to do it every day? Like,
I think we should do it.
No, because you know what? Let me just ask you. I mean, all kinds of things are possible, right?
Yeah.
All kinds of things. Sure, maybe I could go bankrupt. I could get hit by a car. I could get sick today and get a terrible diagnosis. Like, what am I supposed to imagine? Like that's, I think, going a little overboard, isn't it?
Well, they think we should imagine the common misfortunes that can befall us. And I don't know if we have to sit and spend a lot of time visualizing them each day, but I think it behoves us, if we're struggling with emotional problems and resilience, to spend a bit more time on it for a few weeks, let's say. However, I think that we should at least acknowledge these things fleetingly once a day.
Oh, do you think about your own death every day?
Yeah.
You do?
The Stoics have Seneca said, brace yourself for this. I told you, the Stoics ain't playing, right? Seneca said every night when he went to bed, after he kissed his wife goodnight, he'd say, I might not wake up tomorrow morning. That's hardcore. And every day when he woke up, he said, every morning when I wake up, I say to myself that this might be, I'm here, but this might be my last shot at it. This might be my last day.
That's morbid.
And I think that's I think it's a very important observation. Definitely. And I'll qualify this. I should be more serious about it for a moment and say some of the things that the Stoics recommend, because they ain't playing and because they're pretty hardcore, are probably not suitable for everybody to do. So someone who suffers from clinical depression might be well advised not to contemplate their own mortality.
Yeah.
Because it might make them feel really, it might trigger an episode of depression.
Yeah.
Somebody who suffers from panic attacks might be well advised not to visualize, the things that they're frightened of every day, because it could trigger a panic attack. So the Stoics are also very careful to say that we should study ourselves, know thyself, which they take to mean we should study our strengths and weaknesses, and then gauge the challenges that we undertake based on that.
You know which term I liked? It was worry postponement. Yeah. And when I read about that, I think you said in the book as well that actually has been shown it works. It does work. People do better when they, Can you talk about worry postponement? I love that.
The Stoics have a similar idea. So in the 1980s, psychologists began experimenting with a method that at that time was called the stimulus control method of managing worry. It's a behavioural psychology technique. The instructions for this technique are so simple you could almost write them in the back of a business card. So college students in the US were told to notice when they started to worry, and then to write down in one or two words what the topic was that they were worrying about, put it in their pocket, and come back to it at a time of their choosing, a specific worry time. So you would say, okay, I only worry about things between 7:30 and 7:15 each evening. And I only worry about things when I'm sitting in my special worry chair. And even better, I only worry about things when I'm wearing my special hat. I have a special worry hat. Or, maybe I put on special worry time music. I sit down in my chair with my slippers on and my hat and my worry music. I give myself about 15, 20 minutes to worry about stuff. And I'll worry about it And then when the time's up, I'll move on. I might come back to it again the next day if I think it's still worth worrying about. Now, it sounds a bit odd at first, but right out the gate, researchers found that there was about roughly a 50% reduction in the frequency, intensity, and duration of worrying episodes when people did this for a bunch of reasons. And now this basic protocol is widely used in cognitive behavioural therapy and evidence-based psychotherapy protocols, not only for worrying and anxiety, but also it's used for clinical depression, and it can be used for anger management as well. I mean, we could talk all day about what's actually going on here, although the technique itself is incredibly simple.
Yeah.
But basically, worrying is, we have automatic thoughts and we have voluntary thinking. And worrying is predominantly a voluntary process, although people often feel like it's involuntary, it's out of control. But usually when we're worrying, we're kind of having a conversation with ourselves. It can go on for half an hour or several hours, maybe 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes that someone worries for. But the clue is that because it's a sequence of thoughts and it goes on for a while, it can be interrupted. You could stop it and do something else. And so therefore you have control over the process of worrying. Whereas we also have thoughts that pop into our mind automatically and spontaneously. And once you've had a catastrophic anxious thought that pops into your mind unbidden, you can't unthink it. So we have to learn to accept intrusive or automatic thoughts, but to take more control over what we do next if we continue to have a conversation with ourselves about these anxious thoughts. And if you choose, so the problem is that if you're walking along the street and you suddenly, for no good reason, you think, what if I get hit by a bus tomorrow? And then you spend the next 20 minutes worrying about how your kids would fend for themselves and how awful it would be if you got hit by a bus tomorrow. You have the automatic thought that's popped into your mind. It might just be because someone else mentioned it. It might just be randomly it's popped into your mind. Now you've triggered the fight or flight response. A bunch of cognitive biases are activated. You're not in a fit state to problem solve because you're freaking out and you're anxious. So you're in the worst possible state of mind to think this through rationally, right? And so it would be much better for you to wait until you've calmed down and then come back and think it through more calmly and rationally. Because when you're already anxious, when the automatic thoughts popped into your mind, usually you're not thinking clearly, your judgment is clouded, so you'll just make it worse normally by dwelling on an anxious thought, once you start freaking out. So it's useful to postpone it to a specified time. Then by taking more control over your thinking, you'll usually find that you think through things with greater self-awareness and greater objectivity.
Donald, I could talk to you for hours more, but we certainly have covered a lot of ground, lot to think about. That's for sure. I really appreciate your coming on.
We've covered 2,500 years of philosophy in a matter of minutes. With all the collective wisdom of antiquity.
You know what? I have to say, this is truly an example where everything old is new again. I mean, it never actually gets old. This stuff never gets old.
We all reinvent the wheel in that regard. We rediscover perennial wisdom.
Thank you so much for coming on. I hope we can chat again.
I hope so too. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. That's Donald Robertson. He's one of the founders of Modern Stoicism. He is a former cognitive behavioral psychotherapist and the author of 9 books, including How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. For more on his work and also on Stoicism, you can check out our show notes. That's it for the Cram podcast today. We hope you enjoyed it. Please follow us on social. Our handle is @CramIdeas. And we'd love your support to keep our show going. If you'd like to make a donation, you can head over to our website, which is cramideas.com. Thanks for listening and watching. See you back here next time.